Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh.
So on the show today, Shinzen Young. So Shinzen is someone whose work I've been personally very interested in for a while. He wrote a book called The Science of Enlightenment, which I listened to on audio 3 times. So I've listened to about 60 hours of him talk. So this will just be 61. And he consults on neuroscience. He's got a background in mathematics as well as various kinds of very scientific way of looking at things. Very logical is what I get from his work. And Shinzen is obviously a meditation and mindfulness teacher, joining us from the States today. Shinzen, welcome.
It's great to be here.
So I've heard you described as a mindfulness teacher. Should we start with what that is?
I wrote an article about 80 pages long, very dense, with the title, What is Mindfulness?
Yes.
So I'm going to give you the top page summary. First thing that pops into my mind is mindfulness is merely a word in the English language. Therefore, it is going to mean different things in different contexts, and developing what we might call context sensitivity, understanding that words mean different things in different situations. That's part of what I call semantic maturity, which is a very useful, effective thinking tool. So I can tell you how I define it. I like to define mindfulness very broad. I like to define it as essentially a synonym for meditation or a synonym for contemplative practice. So I tend to use those 3 words pretty synonymously: meditation, mindfulness, contemplative practice. Now, I could justify why I've made those choices. That would be a different conversation. But basically, that's how I would tend to use the word. Now, if you look around the world at contemplative practice, aka meditation, aka mindfulness, what do we see? Well, either there can be up to 3 distinct attentional skills involved in a meditation practice. And depending on the tradition, the teacher, those skills might be spoken of explicitly, or they might be dealt with but implicitly, or maybe some of the skills don't really have a major role in a certain tradition. But if we wanted to have a way of dimensionally analyzing all the contemplative traditions in terms of, well, what is what are the basis vectors? You want to be able to know all the dimensions, whether a given teacher talks about those basic dimensions or not. And I would say that the 3 potential dimensions are concentration power, sensory clarity, and equanimity, which you're familiar with because I harp on this over and over again in everything that I do. So that's what you're looking for. The systematic cultivation and application of those attentional skills towards all the dimensions of human happiness. That's how I would define mindfulness.
Great. So it's how much can I focus on something? How much within that can I notice? And how much do I freak out when I notice that?
That would be a beginning.
Okay, so I think that I wanted to start there because it gives people a sense of your rigor. It gives people a sense of some of the distinctions you bring. Like I might say to a student, "Oh, it looks like your sensitivity's got ahead of your equanimity. Therefore, life's going to be a bit stressful for you right now." And so there's ways in which we can look at these different categories. Almost like I heard a meditation teacher, I think it was Daniel Ingram, talk about Dungeons and Dragons and say that it was like, okay, skill 5, weapon skill 8, stamina 7. You could almost look at yourself or your teacher in that way and be like, okay, equanimity 5, but sensitivity only 2. You know, there's a way in which we can start looking at these something abstract, something metaphorical, and actually start looking at it in terms of concrete skill sets. I find that very helpful. So Can we go to the personal a little bit now? So your story is pretty interesting from what I heard. Let's relate it specifically to the body for this audience. So
Sure.
usually with guests, I say, what's your story with the body?
Well, starting at an early age, I would be the classic case of a person that had a lot of problems with the experience of body sensation, both physical and emotional. Essentially, if there was any physical discomfort whatsoever in my body, I would freak out, more than most kids freak out. And if I was around any kind of intense emotions, either in myself or happening in people around me, I would freak out. I'd actually have to absent myself and get out of there. Like if there was a bereavement in a family we knew or something like that, and my parents would go over to comfort them. I could not accompany that, could not handle that. So I would say both in terms of physical type body sensations, if they're uncomfortable, and in terms of emotional type body sensations, if they're uncomfortable. I was probably 2 or 3 standard deviations from the mean in terms of easily freaked out. My mother says I was what they call a difficult child.
Yes.
In that
I love
regard.
how you describe that in mathematical terms, your ability to handle emotions. Okay. So sensitive, super sensitive child.
Yeah. So I would say that the rest of my career would pretty much represent a counterphobic response to that, meaning I have put myself in a variety of traditional training situations where every physical and emotional button that can be pushed is pushed relentlessly and intensely.
Mm-hmm.
And you just have to deal with that. And all that training proved to me that even if you start out with the opposite of concentration, clarity, and equanimity in your body, and even if you have little native talent for those skills, if you stick to it, well, I have a colleague, you might have interviewed him or know him, Dan Harris. You know that name?
It rings a bell. Dan Harris.
He was. So he's got this 10% happier thing. He was Ted Koppel's successor on the Tonight Show. He broadcast from ABC in New York. Anyway, he famously had a meltdown on camera. He had a panic attack. It's embarrassing. It sits there on the YouTube. Anyone can see it. And that was his wake-up call, that he really needed to change his life. And mindfulness was the primary component he used. And he describes the effects of mindfulness as allowing the average person to become 10% happier. If you devote a little more time and effort to it, you could be 10 times happier. So I would say that my body is easily 10 times more fulfilled and free of suffering than it would have been if I had not done that systematic training.
And some of that training was quite severe, wasn't it? Like the sort of dousing yourself in iced water in Japan, or very severe Zen sitting, which people have never done a sesshin, they might not realize how physical that is to sit and do nothing for so long.
Yes, indeed. So you've done some Zen yourself?
Just a little bit, yeah. A couple of sessions.
With whom?
Junpo, Rinzai Zen, and Mondo Zen in the States there.
Cool.
Yeah, and a couple of other little weekend things in Brighton and things like that. But it seemed to me that straight sitting, quite austere, very well bounded. As a martial artist, it kind of actually felt almost too familiar to me. I actually ended up pursuing other forms that were kind of less martial because I felt like I had that piece already. And it was like, but it was very serious, and your whole body's aching. And then, I mean, maybe you could say more than what you certainly can, more than me. Like, talk through some of the sort of physicality of just sitting.
Well, you know, I like to call those our war stories.
Yes.
After you've been through that, after it's over, it's a lot of fun to talk about. So you talk about, you know, what it was like when you were off to war, but when you're actually on the battlefield in a firefight,
Yes.
maybe it's not so much fun, right?
Yes.
But then in retrospect. So, of course, I love to talk about these war stories, but I have to add a preamble, which is the danger in that is that people begin to think if that's what it takes to become an adept or become liberated, what have you, I think I'll put that off a few lifetimes. So
or they think they have to do it, right? They think they have to do some macho shit. You know, they have to kind of
in order
punish,
to
hurt themselves to get any kind of skill.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's the danger in telling these things. That it's like, well, forget about that shit. I mean, who's going to do that? But actually, I'll tell you who's going to go through horrific ordeals. I'll tell you what that population is. Just about every human being that is listening to this podcast.
Yes, you will suffer sooner or later.
Yeah. Life, you will not go to the monastery, but it is a very high probability that the monastery will come to you.
Yes.
The main question is, are you prepared to think of it not as a crisis only, but as your chance to do what the shamans and ascetics and renunciates and monastics have done, East-West, ancient, modern. It could come in the form of an emotional crisis. You may realize that you have to make a major behavior change. You're addicted to gambling or sex or substances, food, what have you. And of course, there's injury and illness. So it will happen. You talked about sesshin. Those are intense Zen retreats. The most intense ones are called the Rohatsu. Actually, that would have been last week. Rohatsu means December 8th. Of course, I know you're broadcasting later, but from our recording date, all over the world in the Zen temples, they did the Daisesshin, the December 8th great session, great retreat. And the traditional way to do that in Japan is 7 days without sleep and without going horizontal. So that's pretty intense. And you might think, well, that kind of intensity is irrelevant to the normal person. But I can tell you that when my father died of lung cancer, he had the best treatment available to middle class in the US. And he went a week without sleeping, slowly suffocating to death.
Yes, yes.
And of course, he was given palliation, but still, that's as intense as anything that anyone ever goes through.
Yes.
It's going to happen. So the wise person has an attitude that, okay, I'm going to prepare myself for this. I'm going to develop the skill set, and I'm going to hopefully have a support structure, a teacher, a coach, someone who is on speed dial. So when the shit really hits the fan, I have some idea of how to get maximum insight and purification from that experience.
Yes, as Jordan Peterson says, it's one thing to go out and ride out and meet the dragon. It's another thing to lie in your bed and hope that it doesn't come, because it will.
It will.
And as my best friend said at his wife's funeral, who I'd helped him marry, this is what we trained for. We'd been through some very intense live-in Japanese-style martial arts training. And when, you know, we're standing there at his wife's funeral trying to keep our shit together at what's probably the worst day of his life, we have that training behind us to fall back on. And he had me that day as well. So the two of us are there together.
The support structure.
Links, and we had the practice. And for him to drive all through the night to come and get me from the airport, because that was the only time I could arrive, just wasn't a big deal because we used to train through the night. So for him, it was just like, okay, I'm missing a night's sleep, no big deal. And to have had that, and I looked at him and he's solid and Polish and just beautifully strong. And I went, if he didn't have that now, he would be no good to her little sister right now. who was the main person he was supporting on that day. And I thought, that's beautiful. And he did the work. And as a result, on the worst day of his life, and for someone else, it's the dad with cancer. For someone else, it's their own cancer. You know, we all have tragedies. And sooner or later, they're going to hit. And you better bloody have some training behind you at that point.
Yes. And you mentioned support structure. So, because even an experienced meditator may forget how to do that. That's the bad news. But the good news is even a beginning meditator, if they have someone to interactively, in real time, following a well-defined algorithm, if they have someone to keep them on track with the practice, even a beginning meditator will get effects comparable to the sort of professionals that go out and go to a Zen monastery or participate in a Stone Age shamanic torture ceremony or something like that.
And you talked about sort of Stone Age ceremonies, and we were talking about sweat lodges just before we started recording. And you know, I think you've made these very interesting parallels between kind of tribal peoples and their practices, which look totally different from a meditation retreat. So could you say something about how there are actually some parallels with those things?
Well, once again, it always goes back to seeing that there are only a few basic dimensions: concentration, clarity, equanimity. So we can develop these skills with a systematic theory that might be quite elaborate, like the Yoga Sutras, for example. But we can also develop these skills by participating in a ceremony. The theory is not elaborate at all, at least with Native Americans. That's the only tribal culture that I'm familiar with. The theory couldn't be simpler. It's summarized in their greeting in the Sioux or Lakota language. One would say, "Mitako yasi." That's a greeting. It's also, but it's also a theoretical model of spirituality. But it's just a couple words, and those words mean we're all related. All my relations, all my relatives. So that's the theory. You got the Yoga Sutras, you've got my essay of 80 pages on mindfulness, and you have 3 words in a tribal language that sum it all up. So very simple theory, and no systematic instruction in techniques. Basically, a technique has 2 dimensions: your focus range and your instruction set. So here's what you're focusing on, here's how you're focusing. That can all be manualized to great complexity, which I have on the internet, as you know, these very complex
so
menus.
Techniques are a simplification of life to develop a particular aspect of life, right? Like a dojo is a place where life is simplified, or a yogashala is a place where life is simplified, and a technique is where you simplify what you're doing within that simplified place.
Now, that's a great way to put it, but it's a systematic simplification.
Yes.
So in a sense, it's a complicated simplification, because we're saying if this happens, it means this, and do that, etc. Now, once again, my contact with cultures that would be have their roots in a pre-literate world is limited to North America. But I can tell you that there's no systematic instruction whatsoever. However, the structure of the ceremony guarantees concentration, clarity, and equanimity. You have no choice. The ceremony leader will tell you to focus on the present moment, okay? And you have to have an acceptance of the physical and emotional sensations that come up when it's very hot or very cold, or you're perhaps being cut, pierced, things like that. You have to go into equanimity. And ordinary people can. So you're encouraged to be present with the ceremony. Well, that just means you're developing concentration. You're forced to have equanimity, otherwise you can't complete your commitment. And very quickly, your mind tends to turn off, and your senses become very, very vivid, although mind is actually a sense gate itself. But sight, sound, and the physicality and emotionality of the body become very sensorially vivid. So the ceremony induces those skills.
Yes.
Even though those skills are not explicitly talked about or systematically trained. So once you know what to look for, something as different as a Japanese Zen retreat or let's say a Christian centering prayer retreat, a Native American sweat lodge ceremony, or a Southeast Asian, say, body sweeping in the Uba-Kin lineage. People are interested in embodiment. That is a great technique. So those look on the surface very different. But when you look at for the underlying basis vectors, what are the components, the dimensions here, you can always see that implicitly or explicitly, it involves one, two, or all three of the core attentional skills.
Yes. I had a friend that does a lot of nature connection stuff, and he just says, listen, nature will provide sensorial richness and it will provide discomfort. So, like if you're hiking in Scotland, these things are going to happen, And so he kind of relates that to some of the skills of meditation, which I thought was interesting. But listen, you talked about embodiment there, and this is obviously our theme for the podcast. Now, people are always asking me on interviews, what is embodiment? And I'd like to ask someone else that for a change. So do you have a definition of that you work with?
It's going to sound like a broken record. You ask me, what is mindfulness? What's the first thing I say? It means different things to different people.
Yes.
What is embodiment? Well, you just said, it's going to mean different things to different people. My definition may not match what other people would say, but I would, if you ask me to define embodiment for myself, that would be very simple. It is an ability. It is an ability to experience your body completely. But then, of course, what do you mean by experience it completely? I would say to experience the body completely means to experience the body in a state of concentration, sensory clarity, and equanimity. Always goes back to the same thing. It's just a slightly different way of talking about the body. Do you want me to say a couple other things that come to my mind when you mention embodiment by way of association?
Yes, very much.
So I just gave you, I guess, what we might describe as my denotation of the word body, embodiment. But there's also connotations. So one connotation I sometimes encounter that I don't like is a privileging of the body over other sensory modalities. Like your mind's a problem, but your body is reality.
Yeah, so the 60s kind of thing of get out of your head and into your body.
Right. And I think that's one of the dangers in talking about embodiment, because people get a sense that, the body's real. I got my shit together if I'm in contact with my body. The mind is a problem, et cetera, et cetera. I find that I like to classify sensory experience into three basic modalities: visual, auditory, somatic. You say, well, where's the mind? Well, the mind is visual and auditory, at least on the surface. We have mental images, we have mental talk. So you actually see thought and hear thought. So it's visual and auditory. So I don't privilege one of those modalities over the other as being more authentic or better or more grounding, etc. the important dimension to me is how completely can you see, how completely can you hear, how completely can you feel, both the inner aspects of those, mental image, mental talk, body emotion, and the sort of outer aspects of those, physical sight, physical sound, and the pure physicality of the body. Another thing that comes to my mind is that a person goes through quite a long sequence of evolution, evolutionary steps in developing the ability to experience the body, quote, completely. So it's actually a lifetime endeavor. And over that period of time, your experience of the body becomes paradoxical. It becomes more and more sensorially vivid, and less a solid something. So it's both more sensorially rich, and at the same time, more and more vacuous, vibratory,
yes. The edges blur.
Spacious. And so you actually, when you have a complete experience of the body, it's a dialectical razor's edge where you have reached maximum sensory richness and minimum material somethingness, which is totally paradoxical. That's the complete experience of the body.
At that point, I'm going to have to go and think about that for like a year at least.
Sorry?
I just want to pause there for a moment because just to take a moment with that, because that's huge what you're saying.
It's huge.
Yeah, there's a piece where I go, I can literally remember not being able to feel each individual toe, for example, before I was doing body practice. It was just a sort of lump at the end of my leg somewhere. And I'm thinking, okay, if I've gone somewhat on the journey, my experience of the body has got so much more rich, so much more vivid, as you say. And then simultaneously, there's a sense of the edges being blurred or being aware of some of the sort of subtler dimensions of the body, or the body itself feeling less separate from everything else. And I go, okay, if I've done a little bit of embodiment, I don't regard myself as kind of the highest end that one can get to in this area. I go, okay, let's say I'm 1% into what could be possible for a human being. And that 1% was radically different than 20 years ago when I started practicing. I'm really curious, like how that keeps opening up. The other thing that opens up for me here is a sort of Zen point of view is you're saying, the full experience of the body, or how did you put it here? Let's look, the complete experience of the body. What's doing the experiencing, right? Like, I think this is key to the embodiment conversation. Is it that we experience our body as an object, which is quite a disembodied point of view, which I hear from a lot of meditators, like I'm meditating on my body. And then there's the more somatic meditators that are kind of meditating as a body, and then other points of view. So where would you sit within that in terms of, to experience the body completely? What experiences the body?
The two perspectives that you mentioned, I call metaphors for equanimity. So obviously, I'm choosing my words very carefully here. So I define equanimity as the ability to allow sensory experience to come and go without push and pull. So metaphor for equanimity means a way to think about equanimity. It's not actually the definition of equanimity. I just gave the definition of equanimity. But that definition is going to sound rather abstract early on in practice. So in order to make it more tangible, you find that people around the world tend to use one of two metaphors. I call the first one the space creating metaphor. It's here, and I, as the observer, am over here. And there's a distance, and I'm going to give you a martial arts example in a moment. So because there's a distance, I'm safe. That's a valid metaphor, as long as you understand that it's just a metaphor. The second is the diametric opposite of that. I call it the space collapsing metaphor. Mm-hmm. I'm so into it, I so own it that it no longer owns me. So I've collapsed the distance. That is also just a metaphor. And I would say that you could use one, the other, alternate them, or not even use those as metaphors because they're just metaphors. So to make it more tangible, wushu or martial art wise, so I'm in the ring with Muhammad Ali at his prime, and I want to not get the shit kicked out of me. What can I do? Well, I can try to keep away from him so he can't strike me, so I'm safe. Or I could take a more radical step and surgically sew his fists to my face.
Well, that would be the hugging strategy in boxing. You get so close
there
they
you
can't hit you.
go. Okay,
So, I mean,
it's much better.
So sort of emotion, it's a better analogy than you thought. So emotionally, there's an emotional range. So a punch is actually only effective within about that range. So further than that, the arm's locked
Is that
out.
about 6 inches?
It's very small range. And under that, it hasn't come to any real power. So it's actually only a very small range that you can be within with a punch, and kicking's longer and elbows is closer, knees is closer. But they talk about these different ranges, and you only have to be slightly off that. You see Muhammad Ali, he'd just move his cheek slightly and the punch would kind of go here and he wouldn't be no impact. So you're saying there's a sort of an emotional range to the sort of emotional triggers we have.
Well, I would think of it as a focus strategy. So yeah, I can either hug him so he can't, wow, that's great. That really improves the metaphor. In the entertainment industry where the comedians, when they talk to each other, say, can I use that?
Oh, yeah. Well, my teacher does this a lot with chain attacks, my Aikido teacher. He sets it as a koan to new students. He attacks them with a chain. And then he says, where's the safe place in the room? And they think it's in the corner or out the door, and they run around the dojo. And eventually they realize the only safe place in the room is closer than where he can swing a chain at them. So you have to have quite a distance to swing a chain at someone.
That's right. So that's the distance collapsing metaphor. So feel free to use either one. Do understand they're just a metaphor. One isn't better than the other. These are just expedients to help people develop what is actually a deeper skill. So if you ask me to recount over the last approximately 5 decades, I've been at it nigh unto 50 years now. I began at 25 with ordination as a monk in the Shingon school in Japan in 1970. So you can do the math on that. I could give you more or less a step-by-step recounting of stages that I've gone through over the last 50 years with regards to the experience of my body. Starting with abject misery that I described, and then learning how to contact more restful states in the body, relaxation, and so forth. And then the body starting to become somewhat more fluid, undulatory, vibratory. That's also somewhat associated with the thinning out of the boundary that you mentioned.
So because to give people an example, that's, for example, if you have a sauna followed by a cold shower, you'll have that sort of tingle. And I just want to, is that kind of the thing you mean?
That's
right?
Exactly the kind of thing we're talking about.
I think it's one of the things people love in Russia, there where I am now. They do the hot saunas, the cold showers, and then there's this spacious, expansive tingling to the whole body, yeah?
Yeah. So the lifter's pump, the runner's high, the cold shower endorphin, the steam room endorphin, the chilly endorphins, you name it. People think of it as a pleasant experience associated with working out. And of course it is that, but to a meditator, particularly to someone who works with the clarity aspect of the practice, I don't think of it as primarily a pleasant result of the workout. I think of it as the body showing me its true nature. What it really is vibrating space. And when you tune into it with enormous sensory clarity, you see that it's bubble bursts. So that becomes available 24/7 as your mindfulness skills grow. Your body becomes undulatory, vibratory. The boundary at the skin tends to become less solid. And in that fluid state, pleasure is more fulfilling. Pain is less problematic. Emotional distress also less problematic. So you're getting three effects: enhanced fulfillment with the pleasant side of the body, reduced suffering with the unpleasant side, and then a sort of insight into the deeper nature of body experience.
Pause there for a moment, because I want to get into that, but I want to just take one step back. So some relationship with the body I've seen yogis and meditators develop is a sort of cut-offness from the body. Like, I'm not my body, I'm meditating on my body, I'm not this, or I can control this. I see that a lot in yogis, in this sort of very Japanese as well, actually. Like, I can control my body as a thing, like almost like force of will. Now, is that a trap? Is that a stage you pass through? You know what I'm talking about, right? This
Sure.
kind of, like, what is that in this evolution?
Well, I would distinguish control over the body from the experience, I'm not my body. I would distinguish those two.
Yeah, the two separate things I'm talking about. But there can be a dissociative, I'm not my body, and there can be a sort of enlightened, well, I am my body on the level of self, but I'm not myself. So, like, there's a disembodied dissociative version of one of those things. And then the second one, as you say, is maybe a related trap or a different trap. What do you think of those?
So I would distinguish control of the body, which is one skill, from two approaches to the body. The one being that I just described. We're actually going back to the same thing: the distance creating metaphor versus the distance collapsing metaphor. So the where this ultimately ends up is a paradoxical experience. And unfortunately, until you have these kinds of experiences, what I'm about to say really sounds like wordsmithery. It sounds like the kinds of things that someone would say if they wanted to one-up you and blow your mind and get your attention and get you to read their book or get you to intimidate you or whatever. It's very off-putting what I'm about to say. I know, because when I heard my teachers decades ago say what I'm about to say, it pissed me off. But now I find that actually you simply have no choice, because you have to call it as you see it. So here's the weird thing. You so fully own your body that the body is no longer a thing. It's like literally a dance of space that's connected to everything.
That doesn't piss me off. Is there something also about these paradox of these two directions, that if we take this point of view, I'm not my body, and create too much space, that can lead to dissociation? But if we take this point of view of I am my body, then that can just lead to being a 2-year-old that has temper tantrums, that has no equanimity. And I wonder if there's something about simultaneously having all this space, but then all this involvement at the same time, like, and boom, at the same time. And it's like that kind of holding both of those two things simultaneously. That's kind of where I'm thinking out loud here. So I hope you and the audience don't mind, but that's kind of what I'm interested in relation to the body, because it seems like neither the other two are the answer on their own.
Yes, but you may not be able initially to hold them simultaneously. So there's a general principle in the sciences called divide and conquer. I love that idea.
Well, it's a British political strategy, Shinzen.
Well,
it sounds... an empire for years. So.
Well, and the word empire comes from the Latin, and dividere et impera, I think, is the original Latin. Of course, it was meant to be political. But as scientists, mathematicians, computer scientists, doctors use divide and conquer, it means something else. It's an incredibly powerful principle. So you take a complicated problem and you divide it into a lot of small doable problems. And then the result of that is that you can handle the seemingly intractable problem. Yes. So the way I teach people, the direction that we're talking about here is I break it up into a set of doable exercises. Some of the exercises create the distance, some of them collapse the distance, some of them have you face just what is, other ones point to the primordial perfection that underlies everything. So I have an algorithm. That's what an algorithm is. You can look it up on Wikipedia. An algorithm is based on the notion that you could have a bunch of small effective procedures. Effective means doable by anyone, but when you weave them together in just the right way, looping, branching, sequentially processing, and so forth, you create this flow chart, and the seemingly impossible becomes possible with time. So the way to deal with that seemingly paradoxical situation, or that dialectical interplay, from my point of view, is work smart. That's why I'm so keen on developing systematic procedures. I have this thing on the internet called ULTRA, the Universal Library for Training Attention Skills. And it's a sort of periodic table of all meditation techniques that ever have existed, or actually ever could exist, because it's all dimensionally analyzed, so there's potential boxes for everything. And so that's how you go about that from my perspective. You work smart, and sometimes you train one side, sometimes you train the other side. At some point that converges to the paradox of liberation.
Yes, and you work very smart. Like, this is why I listened to your thing 3 times. I almost never listened to anything fully once. It was because there was so much clarity in there. Paul Linden is kind of very equivalent to you in the embodiment world. He has algorithms for embodiment, and I invented some of my own based on this idea and renamed them because people didn't like the idea of algorithms. We call them principles, but technically they're algorithms. And I recommend your book for many years to all my students, and I found half of them hate you. Not personally, they just hate the approach because it's so clean. It's so clear. There's a way in which somehow they really don't like it. And the other half go, wow, this is amazing. It strikes me as almost like the most, it's not an accurate word, but the word that comes to mind is masculine approach, in that it's very like cutting things up, dividing things. You'll have distinctions. This is attention in or attention out. And I haven't even begun to map all your distinctions yet. That approach seems to really work for some people, and other people can't stand it.
Well, that's right. The different things work for different people. I have a duty because I have a kind of gift. I have this gift for dimensional thinking and algorithmic thinking. Well, it's not actually a gift. I developed the skills by, in addition to not having much meditation ability, I have very little mathematical ability. So to work my way up to upper division and even graduate level math, that required a lot of work. I was not good at it. The good news is, if you get good at something that you're not good at, you know how to teach it to people.
Yes. Paul Linden says the same thing. He's athletically unskilled and slightly autistic. And he didn't get what teachers were saying, and he had to really break it down and learn it in the smallest pieces. And
Who is that?
Paul Linden. He's he's the embodiment teacher I know that's most like you. LIA, I can introduce you if you like. LIA, he's the one that comes up with algorithms of embodiment. And he basically says, I was a terrible student. I was the worst Aikido student in the dojo. I just didn't get what the teacher was saying. And so therefore, he's a brilliant teacher.
So I had this thing with, also the people that hate my approach among your people, those would be the people most actually like me. Right. Like I was before I trained myself to love that kind of approach. And it was not easy. So I now have the skills of, and I essentially am a scientist. I work with top labs, Harvard, Carnegie Mellon, what have you. So because I have this gift that I purchased at a very high price, I'm now duty bound to use it to create a clear theory of how contemplative practice works and how contemplative practice is related to science.
And to be clear, I love it, just in case you don't, I hope you didn't hear any criticism now. I love the clarity because I spent a lot of time sitting there confused, listening to metaphors and unclear instructions, and it just absolutely did my head in. So when I came across your book, I was like, finally, someone that's got some clear definitions.
Well, so the thing is, any modern person has the power of the gods. Any modern person is Zeus. What made Zeus incredible is Zeus controlled lightning. Imagine how intimidating lightning is if you're in the Stone Age or even the Bronze Age. Now, we understand what lightning is. It's an electrical discharge. We have a very clear theory for the physics of that. It's based on the Maxwell field equations, your countryman, James Clerk Maxwell. Now that's a set of differential equations. And the average person does not need to be able to understand those equations. All they need to do is flip the light switch, and they are Zeus. They control that power. But some human being, Heaviside, Maxwell, Gibbs, many others, people with special training in analytic skills had to figure that shit out at a very deep level. The average person doesn't need that knowledge. They just need to know, hey, don't stick your finger in the electrical plug.
An electrician needs a little bit more knowledge.
Right. So my métier in this life is I'm one of the theoreticians. I want to be the James Clerk Maxwell of the contemplative world. And then people will take those equations and they'll build motors and they'll, invent the light bulb and the radio and these practical things. So there's
and that's important. I think a lot of people who listen to this are teachers. And I think it's really important to know your niche, both from a business point of view, but also from a sort of satisfaction point of view, that some of us are theoreticians, some of us are very practical. Some of us are going to be more working on the kind of emotional domain. And there's place for all of this. And I think there's real satisfaction in kind of knowing yourself well enough as a teacher to say, like my teaching is known for sort of being quite fierce, lots of jokes, lots of swearing. There's a certain style to it. It just isn't many people, it's not everyone's cup of tea, but some people love it. And I look at myself and my history and I go, that's really what I was made for. And I don't want to force myself to become Shinzen Young or Paul Linden or anyone else as I develop. So I think there's some real satisfaction for teachers to understand their brand would be the business term there, And I've actually heard that you might replace yourself with a computer program. Like this would be your lineage successor would be a computer. Is this true or is this just a joke?
Well, what Mark Twain said when there were false rumors that he had died in the press.
Mm-hmm.
he said, rumors of my demise have been greatly exaggerated. So rumors that I'm replacing myself with the computer program have been greatly exaggerated. My goal is not to replace teachers. I think of so let me just back up. I do believe that the most effective way to equip people with mindfulness skills and to support them in applying those skills to all dimensions of happiness is to have at least one competent personal coach. I'm pretty sure that it's the same in the athletic training world. If you can afford it, you've got a personal coach. So I would like every human being in the world to have access to a personal coach. When at the end of a retreat, I look out, maybe there's 80 people in the room, and my thought is, if only I could divide myself into 80 versions, go home with each one of them, and I had no other job in the world but to support their practice for the duration. It is highly probable that many of them would become enlightened, but can't do that. So what's the next best thing I can do? Don't think of Bright Mind. That's the name of the app, by the way. It's called Bright Mind. It was originally developed actually from people from Vermont, where I live. But in any event, I don't think of Bright Mind as a lesser teacher. I think of it as a vastly improved book that can interact with you and serve. If it can do even 60% of what a competent personal coach can do, but it costs you a couple bucks, then we can make this available to the world. So it doesn't replace the teacher, but there's a lot of things that I do that are very rote. And so my philosophy is let the machines do what the machines are good for, freeing up the teachers to do what only a human being can do.
Absolutely. So like, I mean, this is how I use video on my courses. I say, watch these 2 hours of video before you come to the course. This is just some information. You don't need to interact with me for this. And the quantum leap from books and videos to a program is some level of interactivity, right? So there's at least, because a book was a kind of quantum kind of leap cheating mechanism for teachers 100 years ago, right? Like the idea that you could write down your words, that's insane.
It's a game changer.
It's a huge game changer. The printing press and then the internet was the next one, right? Like my videos have millions of hits. This podcast is going to be listened to by, thousands of people, but it's still one way. So no one listening to the podcast can ask a question or can go, oh, well, but actually my situation is different because I've just had a child. So how can I meditate when I have a child? That's a question I got the other day, for example, right? And I went, I don't know, who got one of my students who was a parent, and they said, this is what I do, right? So it's like that we're able to interact with the community in that case, not just the teacher, and find an answer for that person. And that's way better than just like one-to-many broadcasting.
Yep. So, no, I'm not replacing myself, but and I should say that Bright Mind will become more and more interactive. It's going to go through many iterations, but it's the beginning of Guru in your pocket.
Fantastic, good stuff. I look forward to the Amazon or Google version in my sitting home. I've got this headband at the moment where I measure my brainwaves, so afterwards I could get some kind of Shinzen Young kind of pre-recorded advice afterwards or something based on my brainwaves. So that could be fun. I mean, we're talking about the sort of science here right now. It's like bands. You were into neuroscience before they were cool. Like neuroscience is kind of a fashion. There's a lot of what I call neuroblaggers who do a lot of what I call neurobunk.
What is it?
Neuroblagger. So a neuroblagger is someone that uses neuroscience to justify their existing position in order to gain authority and credibility. For example, if I put a brain with a blob of color on a screen, corporate audiences will believe anything I say, I found. So
yes, what we call that? What do you call that? Neuroscientists call what? Blagger, did you say? Is that a UK?
Blagging is a very British phrase. Yeah, it's a like
okay.
Something like that.
That's great. Blagger, I love this. Hold it just a second.
So a blagger would be someone that doesn't really know what they're doing, but is trying to convince people otherwise. Like oh, how did you get into that job? Oh, I blagged it. I didn't really have any experience, So
I love it. So let me tell you what we call neuroblagging, people that are in the research community. We call it blobology.
blobology.
Yeah.
I like it. So there's a colored blob.
Yeah.
And people go, oh, that means that I'm right. That means that I'm neuroscience, like God says. Neuroscience says that I'm right.
That's right. This proves I'm right. We call it blobology. And it's basically modern phrenology. It's
Yes.
However, I should say, unlike phrenology, blobology will evolve in this century into real science.
Yes.
So there is a huge potential there. I compare our current situation to Galileo. There's this great picture of painting of Galileo showing the Doge of Venice his new invention, which is the Galilean telescope. And they're looking at the moon, and they're seeing that the moon is not perfectly spherical, as Aristotle and the Catholic Church claimed. So Galileo knew he was onto something. But if you compare the Galilean telescope to the Hubble Space Telescope.
Yeah, sure.
So
actually, I'm going to jump in. Let's take a step right back. There's a beautiful moment in your book where you talk about when you first realized that subjective states could be had objective correlates. So you talk about, I think it was a colleague, and they come in and they give you a paper. And this was, I said, before it was cool, before everyone was talking about this. Like, can you describe that moment? Because I think that says something quite significant. Do you know which moment I mean?
I think so. I had a friend that was an Irish Jesuit, Roman Catholic priest. He wrote many books, Father William Johnston, and we used to meditate together. He was an academic, and he knew Japanese physiologists who were studying Zazen, Zen meditation. Now, we're talking about the 70s, early 70s now. And they actually, the Japanese had been into this from even before World War II. As soon as they knew about brainwaves, they were looking into meditators because it's part of their culture. So Father Johnston was very excited by the notion that science could cooperate with spirituality. I mean, he's a priest, right? And this is, there has been a troubled history between science and his religion, and that there could be a cooperative thing that was very exciting to him. And then I'm thinking, I was just about to leave Japan, come back to, quote, the West, and I'm thinking, I've sort of scaled the mountain of Asia. I wanted to become Japanese when I was a little kid, and I actually sort of did it. I was starting to meld into Japanese society. If I had stayed there, I would have become a light-skinned, big-nosed Japanese person. But I'm going back to the US, where I came from. I've scaled the peak of Asia. I've, in a sense, mastered its culture, or I have a deep understanding of the culture here. And its single most important worldwide, its single discovery of greatest worldwide importance is the science of meditation, which is a subjective science. And I'm sitting on this peak of Asia, which is meditation, and I'm thinking, do I see another peak someplace that impresses me as much? And there is. And it came from the West, interestingly, or at least its most modern form. Of course, it actually comes from the world. But a Renaissance on, we have Europe dominating science. Before that, it was Islam. Before that, it was other places. So recently, it's come from the West. It's science, it's modern science. Another countryman of yours, Isaac Newton, oh my God, right? God said there was Newton. God said, let there be Newton, and all was light. So post-Newton, modern science, that's very impressive. Father Bill thought, wow, these two worlds can come together. And me personally, it's like, oh, okay, I'm at the peak of Asia. I need to also be able to sit at the peak of the West and then see what kind of mating dance and what kind of Wunderkinder may be born from that. And so that was the seed of it in the early 70s.
And so that's the early 70s. And when I was doing psychology in the late 90s at university, there was a few dusty Japanese neuroscience of meditation books, and neuroscience was just coming into the university as a big thing, but it hadn't really been connected with meditation because the whole mindfulness boom hadn't really happened yet. And then over the 20 years I've been involved, I've just seen it take off. And, I have this brainwave sensing headband now, which I got for $200, which would have cost thousands of bucks when I was at university. It was like you would have had to have a special permission to go use that equipment in the university. And, now it's just like a commercially available thing. There are various apps measuring all sorts of things now, wristbands that measure things that are going to increase. And it just seems like where's this going? Like, it's been a hell of a journey the last 20 years. And I don't think we're anywhere near sort of the peak of this.
You want my opinion as to where it's going?
Yeah.
How much time do we have? Aren't we sort of nigh unto?
We got 10 minutes, and I've got one more
10 minutes.
For you. So give me
Okay.
5 minutes on this, and I've got 5 minutes on one last question.
Okay, good. So I think you probably know who the U.S. baseball player Yogi Berra was.
I've heard of him. Yeah.
And he was known for these malapropisms, which are just fantastic. And one of them goes something like, I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like, I never make predictions, especially about the future. So the history of science is strewn with great scientists making horrible predictions.
Yeah.
Another UK scientist, Lord Kelvin, famously said towards the end of the Victorian period, I guess.
Science is done. This guy.
But basically, the rest of physics lies in the nth decimal place, meaning there's not going to be any fundamentally new discoveries in physics, right? And a few years later, radioactivity was discovered, then quantum theory, relativity.
The next 5 years then. What could you predict?
I never make predictions about the future, but if I were to make a guess, just a guess, if we are able to survive another century or so, in other words, barring a catastrophic collapse of global civilization, I think it is highly likely that the combination of neuroscience and contemplation, the modern mindfulness movement, contemplative practice co-evolving with science, I think it's not unreasonable that that combination would dramatically change the entire planet for the better. In other words, it's not just a game change. It's not just a game changer in the sense that you change the rules of the game. I think it's not unreasonable that it would actually change what the game is on this planet, on life, the game of life. The game has always been competition for limited resources. Once you understand how to have complete experiences, you understand there's a whole other dimension, your ability to utilize the resources you have. That's a completely different game. And so it's not unreasonable that some of these mythological ideas that there could be a kind of messianic, sudden, dramatic change for the better, I actually think that is not unreasonable. I'm not going to say it's going to happen, but it's not unreasonable. And that gives me a lot of hope
for
the world.
this is like the Dalai Lama writing Star Trek. This is fucking amazing. I love this. And this is sort of Fermi paradox of, do civilizations all destroy themselves before they get to that point? Or is there something which happens at that point, which means they become kind of less visible in a way, which might be actually a very beautiful thing? And I really wonder about this. So I think that's super hopeful. I need to run out the door and go teach 30 beautiful Russian yoga teachers, #tough life. Before we do, however, I need to ask you a question. So really like practical, the last question. What mindfulness practice best support embodiment? So for example, I get all my body embodiment teachers meditating. The first thing I do is contracted with them actually. But like, what practices should I be suggesting they do as a way to support their embodiment?
Two things come to mind. I can certainly give a suggestion. Actually, it popped into my head as soon as we started to talk. I was going to mention it, but now you brought it up. But before I sort of mention that, it's actually not so much what the technique is, but whether or not you have a structure of practice. So a structure of practice is, yes, you need at least one technique, but you need to do retreats, you need to do life practice, you need to get support for your practice, and you need to learn to give support to other people's practice. Those I call the 4 pillars. You can read about it in my outline of practice essay that's on the internet. So it's actually more an issue of establishing and maintaining those 4 pillars of practice than it is an issue of, well, who should I meditate with or what technique should I use? Having said that, if I had to say one thing that someone in the embodiment community should look into if they want to look into, quote, mindfulness, it would be the U-Ba-Kin, U-B-A-K-H-I-N. Those are 3 separate words capitalized. The U-Ba-Kin lineage of mindfulness or vipassana, which entails systematic sweeping through the body, sometimes called bodies.
As a sort of, Vipassana 10-day retreats based on this?
Mr. Goenka has created a large organization giving 10-day courses in the U-Ba-Kin lineage. But it's important not to refer to it as Goenka's meditation technique because it's his teacher, U-Ba-Kin, and he's not the only person that teaches that, but he's the most prominent person. And those retreats cost you $0. You don't even have to pay for your room and board.
It's donation-based, right? Yeah.
And they're extremely well organized. And it's a very powerful way of working. I have to say, on the negative side, there's a little hint of cultishness in that organization.
And a little bit severe for some beginners, I've seen.
Well, yeah, but you know me, severe is not...
for normal people, Shinzen, not me and you.
Yeah, that's there are legitimate reasons to bitch about those 10-day courses, but for me, it's severe is not one of those reasons. You went there because you wanted to do some serious work. But there's a little hint of, we have the one true only pure lineage and the others don't. However, it's just a hint. Everything else is so great that I totally recommend it to people.
Fantastic. And so I love this. I'm going to look this article up in terms of the pillars. So it's not just the technique, it's that you're doing meditation retreats, that you're teaching others, you're receiving guidance, that you've got a regular practice, and you're also learning to apply that regular practice in life.
Do you provide links with these programs?
Most people won't see them, but if people go, the links like your link will be on the our webpage, on the Embodiment
Because I can
webpage.
give you well, let me just mention, in terms of retreats, most people can't do a residential retreat. So I have something called the Home Practice Program,
Yes.
which pipes the retreat into you. In terms of systematic life practice, they can go to the Life Practice Program. It's another web offering. And then if they want to get support and learn to give support, they can go to the unifiedmindfulness.com, Juliana Ray's program, which is just excellent, where she'll give you support and teach you how to give support. So those are the resources readily available to the world if people want to work.
And your website, Shinzen, if people want to find you online, because most people would just hear the audio.
Well, they would just go to shinzen.org.
Shinzen.org. Okay, I've pushed this right to the very limit of what I can because it was such a good interview. I kind of almost already want to get you back already, and it's already the longest interview I've done for the podcast. This has been fantastic, Shinzen. I was expecting big things, but this has really, really been amazing. I so much appreciate it. Do you have a closing message about the body before we sign off?
Experience it completely.
Okay, I'm going to go do that at work tonight. So Shinzen, thank you so much.
It's been brilliant. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
And maybe we'll do it again.
Subscribe to get more. And you can also leave us a review on iTunes, which helps with our rankings. So really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support the podcast even more, then fund us. Go to Patreon. Give us $1 per episode. Those who don't know, Patreon's a really good way of supporting things you want to see more of in the world. I know so much is available for free now, and what I'd say is a lot of energy and effort goes into this podcast. I put it out there for free so everyone can get it. More than I work on this. Everyone that wants it can have it for free. And if you want to support us, it is really appreciated. So it's patreon.com/Mark Walsh. And of course, if you want any in-person training, you can visit embodiedfacilitator.com. There's loads more resources there too.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.